Oscast.
Welcome to STRATEGIKON.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. I'd like to welcome back co-host David Oldie. Lovely to be here. And also producer Michael McGarley.
Good to be here too.
Just that the audience knows that you're with us. We are coming to you via Zoom since poor Michael has been hit by the dreaded vid. Today's topic will be Peter Zeihan's book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, a book of some controversy because of its dark message. David, when I first started hearing about Peter Zeihan, I thought I might have to do a little bit of investigation. Now, where that led me was a bunch of YouTube videos, which were very interesting in and of themselves. And then there was this idea that I better read one of his books before I really could get into any more of what he had to say. One of them was about America's energy independence, something about shale oil. I can't remember the exact title, but the fact of the matter is, it was a very dry read, very dry, very difficult to get your head around. The message was simple enough, but the details were not as engaging as one would have been used to finding in an audio book of that kind of topic. I mean, what do you think about Zeihan as an IR scholar, and do you find him well informed, or do you think that there is a sort of sense that there's a touch of arrogance to the way that he's actually presenting his material?
Oh, wow. So many things to jump on there.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. First, he isn't an IR scholar because he's not interested in frou-frou theory. He's interested in quantifiable data. So give him information about demographics or energy or food and let him run the analysis. So he's far more a traditional intelligence analyst than he is an academic or scholar.
Right.
The book is profoundly boring because he's used to writing reports for clients who pay him lots of money to work out how to have an economic advantage.
Right.
So he is not our normal person to read or engage with because he's normally talking to billion-dollar companies. And his books were really aimed at informing the people where they might be interested in one aspect of what he was talking about, but he needs them to understand the other 9 or 10 aspects.
The one thing that I kind of noticed, even when looking at him addressing a military audience in the United States, is that there was a sort of snarkiness to much of his commentary. I mean, I think a lot of what he has to say is very interesting and certainly deserves to be looked at with a fair degree of holy crap. But in the end, is there not a sense that he ought to be able to present the message slightly differently from the way that he did, to give at least some form of hope in the message? I mean, you're doing strategic communication. I'm wondering, from your perspective, how good he is as a strategic communicator. I thought that he was lacking in certain parts. Okay, to our audience, apologies, but we were having some technical issues. So I'm currently upstairs in my little studio nook, and David is downstairs, sitting on the couch, coming to you without video. So don't freak out. David is still here. It may be a blank screen. If you have a disembodied voice, it's nothing to be scared of. That's all I have to say. You can put that in, Michael. All right. So anyway, David, as we
do you want me to jump back into where we were?
Yes, if you can.
Okay. So really speaking about what Zeihan is doing in terms of communications, we only see and hear what Zeihan is like when he is talking to the general public on YouTube, where he is deliberately, in my opinion, trying not to sound like an IR scholar, because guess what? He's got a lot more things right than most IR scholars. So his brash thing is, I think, a very good way of coming across differently. It also makes much more sense when he is working in the world of alpha corporate types who are all, well, do you believe what you say? So I think really he's developed his tone from being at Stratfor and dealing with very rich clients. Also, he very deliberately doesn't talk about military stuff that directly relates to the US military, I'm guessing because he has a very good information source and doesn't want to piss them off. And my guess is he would behave very differently, because having been in Washington and then having been at Stratfor and built his own business and bouncing around the world off the basis of his own business, he does a much better job, I think, of targeting audience. And I'll give you the comparison of, say, him and Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer sounds like a smug ex-academic now making a bag of money every minute of every day in every context. There's not a lot of subtlety. It's Ian Bremmer 24/7. My feeling is that Peter Zeihan is a much more nuanced person who is tailoring the message to the audience. And depending on how much you pay, depends what message you get too. So my guess is everything we get on YouTube, we're only getting a week after the clients who matter got it.
Now, David, with regard to the message, and I do agree with you with regard to Ian Bremmer. I mean, you know, I have seen plenty of his YouTubes coming in live from Davos, and I kind of think that once you associate yourself with that crowd, it then becomes a little bit sort of difficult to see him acting in a real world capacity, because obviously when you're mixing with the elites, you are an elite puppet, whether you want to admit to it or not.
More all I hear is canapes. That's now the word I associate with Ian Bremmer.
And fine wine. But, you know, with regard to Peter Zeihan's book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, the central theme that Zeihan puts forward is a very bleak one. It doesn't leave a lot of room. It doesn't leave a lot of room for improving human nature as we currently understand it. And actually, I'll you know, link back to the whole Ian Bremmer thing. I mean, if you take a lot of leftist political thought and you say, well, the ills of the world are caused by capitalists at the highest order, most of those capitalists in the highest order are either Bilderberg or they're, you know, Davos or, you know, Wall Street, or these centers of power that we know are so unapproachable. Do you think that these centers of power actually care about what damage their policies or their preferred policies have done to the planet, to our countries, to our societies? Do you think that they're really that clueless that they're just continuing to do the same thing, expecting a different result, maybe with a couple of extra wind farms just so they can feel good?
I'm not sure if clueless is the word I would use. I think what Zeihan is describing very well is the world you end up with when the elites are in an echo chamber. And I think the echo chamber comes from a few things that he doesn't outline directly because he's not an IR scholar. He's an analyst. So he looks at things he can quantify. But we have the background in theory and history to fill in some of those gaps. And to me, the big thing he doesn't write about that is critical to what he is writing about is that, you know, since World War II, neoliberal economics has grown from an obscure right-wing fringe ideology to the dominant paradigm in much of the global economy. And whether you are left or right anymore, how do you conceive of an economy that is not run on neoliberal principles? Now, historically, neoliberal economics have never existed and have never worked. It is a delusional idea, you know, born of, you know, bad literature from pre-World War II and then doubled down on from 1946 onwards. So what we've got is an elite that have all drunk the same Kool-Aid, who all hire aides who reflect their worldview, who are all surrounded by people who in the end want their job and aren't going to contradict the status quo when it's the status quo that hands out the meat and gravy. So what we are seeing is what happens when you run the world by an ideology rather than by proper analysis, like Zeihan does, and what happens when an elite is constantly recruiting people who want to be part of the elite and who therefore their vested interest is the system as it is. And the system as it is economically, politically, environmentally, industrially, resource-wise untenable. Now, a lot of people have made that argument. Richard Heinberg made the argument in The End of Growth in 2011 about the system being untenable, but he did his analysis as someone that believes in the better side of human nature, that a clean environment is a better place to live, and that we should all be ashamed of where we've gone. Now, Zeihan doesn't need to use the idealist or shame card to point out the mess we're in. He just actually uses the data. So what is so uncomfortable about Zeihan is you can't go, well, I don't agree with his ideology. He's ideologically driven. No, he's not. He's data driven, and that's why it's so uncomfortable. Because if you don't like it, it's very hard to undo it, because it's not based on any ideology. It's not based on wanting to go kumbaya and live in a better world. It's based on, here's the data, here's the trend line. Oh, crap.
So let's look at the data for a moment. So the central theme of Zeihan's book is that whether you believe in, capitalism, autocratic / fascist / communist, totalitarianism, as certain countries do, the fact is that we're all hitting the wall at the same time because, well, basically, we've hit peak human. And as we've hit peak human, that means we've hit peak market, which, if we look at the sort of neoliberal form of capitalism, markets predicated on growth, but without people, we have no markets, and so therefore we have no growth. Now, considering the fact that many European countries are in negative demographic territory, that is, that they're just not breeding up anymore, the Japanese certainly have stopped. The Russians are having a major problem. Here in Australia, we're worried about fertility rates. Sperm count has dropped off the radar, and the only real hope for countries like Australia is increased immigration from high fertility countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, Latin America. They still have quite a bit of population that they can shuffle around. But apart from that, we're all screwed. Now, if that's the case, this is going to have extraordinary problems with regard to how we view ourselves as nation states in what will be a much more fluid world. There will be a transmigration of the rich, from the poor countries to the rich countries. This is going to be an unavoidable aspect. And of course, there's going to be that inevitable backbite from local people who think that the foreigners are going to take our jobs and run roughshod over our cultures and our identities. So the likelihood of seeing where Australia, the United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America are going to be, say, 10, 15, 20 years from now is an absolute boondoggle of a mess. Do you think he's that spot on, or do you think that there is some margin of error that even as cluey as Zeihan is, that he has missed something fundamental to where we are as a global community?
I think there's a few things going on. Somewhere he's very good, and somewhere without data he won't make a guess, because he doesn't make guesses. He follows data. So the demographic data is right. The majority of the world is aging. The majority of the world is going to die and not be replaced by people. For the world in the long run, this is a very good thing. There will be less people, but in the long run, more resources per person. So 50 years from now, it'll be much better to be in a world of 4 billion people. That will be a much nicer place to be in terms of, will there be enough resources to go around? He doesn't really deal with migration, which I think is the great flaw of the book, if there is a great flaw. Or it's one of those things where, of course, as things get worse, migration flows aren't going to be predictable like they have been historically. We're going to see migration flows as things get worse, more like the migration flows at the end of World War II. People just exiting places that are a mess. So in the case of Australia, well, we do well when we're importing migrants. As much as some Australians have a problem with this, the reality is the only way we're going to have effective aged care and childcare and a health system is if we import young people from Africa and India, the places where there are going to be an excess of young people and still limited resources. So the big thing about the world ahead of Zeihan's predictions that he doesn't talk about, because it would require a hypothesis rather than data, is what does it look like when people start moving? Now, Australia is a country of migrants. So I would actually say if we manage migration sensibly and tell grumpy old Australians to shut up and remind them that the only way they're going to get someone caring for them in aged care is if we have large amounts of migration. Get over it. These are the people that are going to be our future. Our future is not going to be white and where everyone's families 3 generations ago was a farmer. That version of Australia is over. But an Australia that in the next 20 to 30 years accepts and incorporates 10, 15 million young people with education, motivation, and who only see opportunity and want to be a part of something that's free and good, that's a different Australia. That's a very good Australia.
Yeah, but there's a problem with that, isn't there? I mean, at the moment here in Australia, and I know that in Canada, New Zealand, maybe to a lesser degree the United States, because God knows what is happening over there. But, we're all running off this multicultural dialogue. And arguably, that's already been a very divisive kind of social experimentation in terms of
but you notice I didn't say multiculturalism. I said importing young, motivated people.
Yeah,
this is going to be a hard world in which national identity is non-negotiable. You arrive somewhere, you enter whatever potentially successful fortress you choose to join, because the world is going to be a series of fortresses. The biggest fortress will be the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Their demographic problem is going to be solved by Latinos broadly. And that was predicted by Samuel Huntington in the early 2000s. That America's future is not being white and agricultural either. So a big part of people not dealing well with Zeihan's book is the group that are going to, in a sense, lose their privilege because they're simply going to cease to exist is the white middle class, who have been on terminal decline for 40 years.
Interesting you should say that. The idea of being able to get a lot of disaggregated nation states, many of whom have these relatively significant pockets of nationalists living within them, where, a German is a German, a Greek is a Greek, and French, all the way through. The idea of them recognizing the historic truth, which is they have always been nations that had to suck in a lot of migrants from a lot of different parts of the world, and they incorporated them over time, seems to not be hitting the history books at any level within these particular countries. And arguably even in Australia, we've got this whole white Australia thing that in spite of the facade of multiculturalism, we still subconsciously hang on to. So in terms of seeing the future and seeing potentially mass migration as being how we solve many of these problems moving forward, the demographic decline of the old order, if you will, this is going to be a bloody exercise. This isn't going to be about some politician sitting in Canberra or Washington or London writing up a form and everyone just accepting it willy-nilly and saying, well, it's going to be good for us. We've got, all these new migrants coming in and giving us healthcare benefits. No, they're going to be fighting tooth and nail to say, these are foreigners coming in, taking our jobs from our children. And so therefore they need to be fought. And again, it will look very similar to, Attila the Hun, coming in with his vast, migrant hordes into Western Europe and probing various areas. This is going to be a very uncivil mess, because one of the things that we haven't spoken about at the moment is the collapse of global civilization, which is what Zeihan is basically hinting at. This isn't going to be a peaceful transition. This is going to be a case of people will continue with a delusional fantasy that we can make the system as it's currently structured transition into a much more peaceful and harmonious way of life. It ain't going to happen because it never happened in history. Now, we may think that, well, we're in the 21st century, we have technology on our side, we can make anything happen if we have the will to make it happen. But I would argue history does not sound that it's, history says that it will not be that way.
First thing I think there is to realize that when we had less people and more resources, we brutalized each other for power and control over resources. So even when there's less people and more stuff, our solution was still not kind, it was violent. So we're just returning to normal. Second of all, If you are a country like Australia that can either die out or grow and thrive, it's not going to be politicians going, we can't solve this with a pen stroke, or we want to keep people out because they're not us. It's, we have an incredible heritage of building a successful liberal democratic state. Do we go out or do we grow? Because they're the only two choices. And growth will mean change. And a political elite that can't get on board with that change is a dead elite. To my sort of perspective, the Liberal parties, trouncing in the most recent federal election, the most recent state election in South Australia, are perfect examples that even if Australia is not ready to change dramatically, it certainly knows it can't continue as it was.
Right.
The fact that we've got an American president with an approval rating of 36%, less than Bush Jr. on the day before 9/11. The system as a whole stinks to most people at this point, but they haven't woken up to the challenges ahead. As I said a few minutes ago, we're not talking about a nice world. In 2011 or 12, whenever Ian Bremmer wrote Every Nation for Itself, he talked about pivot states collecting states who wanted to work with them because it was a win-win situation. In a sense, it's another thing Zeihan didn't write about because he's an analyst of data, not a theorist. He was really describing a world in which if you set yourself up as a pivot state, you win.
Right.
It's quite clear that the United States, Canada, and Mexico, whether the Canadians and Mexicans want it, they're going to become part of a successful bundle. Whether the political elites are happy or not, the people will be happy to be inside something that's self-sufficient and stable. Whereas if we look, the only other bit of the world that is going down a similar path, potentially, based on Zeihan's data analysis, is Australia, Japan, and Southeast Asia. But that will require a massive shift. Japan is probably not willing to act like a middle power based on, its behavior since World War II. And Australia doesn't have the confidence to be a proper middle power. But Australia and Japan together could secure the seaways. Japan can do high technology, Australia can do food. With that combination, plus the populations and willingness to work and try of Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, the potential to build a really meaningful, Pacific East Asia, I don't even know what phrase we should use. So Zeihan doesn't hypothesize what's possible in the long run. He says, what does the data tell me? Well, the data tells him that our region might be the exception outside of North America. Whereas North America has the Americans who are used to dominating, it will genuinely rely on consensus where we are to do something meaningful. And that consensus will have to be based on, we're inside a fortress. And if you don't make the fortress good, things are going to be awful. So I don't think this is a case of nationalisms getting in the way. It's that reality has to terrify people enough to get over their historical and useless nationalisms.
Well, there's another thing that Zeihan also put forward in his book, and that is the effect of climate change, which I thought was rather refreshing because usually people tend to separate geopolitics from climate change as two different and distinct issues. And as you and I both know, David, because we talk about it a lot in private conversation, climate change is part of the fabric of life, and to ignore it is ridiculous because it will come back and bite you from a policy perspective. But Zeihan says that even here in Australia, we are going to be like one of the frontline states, if you will, with regard to climate change and its increased ability to make life particularly hard here. So I suppose what you're saying is right at one level, but then there's the other level of, well, yes, we're doing this in a situation where climate is going to fluctuate extremely, basically for the Japanese and for the Australians. But in Australia, the summers, which have always been hot, are going to get far hotter. And when the wet weather hits, as we are currently seeing with the eastern seaboard of Australia right now, it's going to be devastating. So infrastructure is going to be swept away, or it's going to crumble because of the excessive heat. In Japan, we have a very hardworking population, but they all live in high-rise apartments, mostly in the dense city of Tokyo. Getting air conditioning happening for those people so they can work in an environment which is going to be easy for them to work in is no longer a thing, because, of course, we need to burn fossil fuels to get baseload power to operate the air condition, to therefore get productivity. Because when workers are not productive because they say it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too wet, the roads have just washed away, I can't get to my office anymore, well, it's going to have a very significant effect on how we go about our lives, right?
It must be about 2 years ago we were talking about this one day, and it was a period where a big report had come out on climate change, and they were going, look, the window to slow the problem of climate change is closing. And you and I, sat, and I think we were, watching the YouTube version of the presentation. And in the end, we had a conversation about, well, okay, the ideal solution, that's actually now gone. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Now it's time for adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was adaptation before the gun to the head of demographics, access to energy, access to food, and no one providing global security for international trade.
Mm.
It was before 3 guns to the head.
Mm.
So guess what? In the world that's coming, if you want to have a tantrum and a cry about saving some silly little hopping mouse that bounces around the center of Australia, feel free.
Mm.
But I'm going to build a nuclear power plant and a pumping station and refill inland Australia with water and change our climate.
Exactly.
So I think what we're saying here is the era of politicians who wring their hands and environmentalists who haven't grasped yet, they keep going, oh, but we're all going to die if climate change goes forward. No. We're all going to die if we don't adapt to it. And we are not in the keep it nice phase. We are in the adaptation phase, and we haven't yet met the leaders who are willing to speak in terms of adaptation. Now, Zeihan is assuming that America will go there because it always does the brutal, nasty thing, because it doesn't seem to have a sense of what happens next.
Yeah.
We need to start going, it's time to stop doing hand-wringing and start having leadership. And many, many ugly things are going to happen in the next 20 years to adapt to the new world. But we can either adapt or we can die in higher levels. Choose.
Well, this raises another issue, and it's an issue that we've spoken many times about, and that is the rights and expectations of First Nations peoples. Now, here in Australia, we have Aboriginal land rights, which is a great thing on one hand. When everything is going well, we can afford to throw our platitudes to the local First Nations people here in Australia and say, yes, you can lock up the resources of that land because of years of colonial oppression and white oppression. And yes, we're all filled with guilt. And so therefore, we will not drill a hole in your ground to extract resources that we know you're sitting on top of. Those days will have to come to an end. Who in Australia, which party, what sort of politician do you think that we have in Australia that would confront the local Indigenous in this country, let alone places in the United States and even Canada, or dare I say New Zealand, where they are very organized, highly activist. They have the ear of the media, and the media is quite happy to browbeat the political elite in every country because they want to be seen to be doing the right thing. And yet they will also, by being seen to be doing the right thing, screw the country's prospects into the future. I mean, I hate to put it to you like that, but I will, because I think the time for blunt thinking and talking is now.
I don't think any of our politicians will survive the transition. Yep. All our politicians are of a system that assumes gradual improvement is the natural path of the world. Gradual improvement is a dilution of 1945 to 1990, maybe can be extended till 2001. Mm-hmm. It's an illusion that would be more kindly called a delusion.
Yeah.
At some point, we have to recognize if we don't secure sea lanes, we won't have international trade, we'll have food, we won't have pharmaceuticals. Try dealing with that as a population. We also need to accept that we either go under or we evolve. And if we evolve, it means probably absorbing 20 million people from around the world who are young, educated, and motivated.
Mhm.
And when they arrive here, they're going to arrive here because here is better than wherever they came from. And are they going to care about Indigenous rights, or are they going to care about a base level of quality of life for every citizen, including the most recent person to arrive? Is any of this going to be nice? No. It's one of the reasons Zeihan doesn't hypothesize about this kind of stuff. This is not stuff he has data on. This is the mess of human culture, psychology, and neurology. We like the world we have, we like the culture we have, we like the people we care about, but all of that is gradually going to become more and more at risk, whether it's from lack of food, lack of energy, lack of pharmaceuticals, lack of international trade, lack of international investment, being crushed by a changing climate that we refuse to adapt to. We keep pretending, no, we can save things. Don't save things. It's too late. Adapt. That's really what Zeihan's book is saying. Either adapt early or risk not adapting at all.
One of the things that his book also talks about is the fact that the United States is going to gradually, if not more suddenly, decide that, hey, listen, the days of the US Navy patrolling the world's oceans and making it safe for trade are over. That the United States is going to find its way back to its more historical default setting, which is isolationism. Now, if and when that occurs, that obviously opens things up to great power aspirants such as China to start patrolling further and further from the 9-dash line and into areas that they would never have conceived of when the US Navy was out on patrol in force. So that in itself is going to create all sorts of issues in terms of the way that the United States not only sees the value of allies that are basically in far off lands like Australia, but also, what do countries like Australia actually do in a situation like that? I mean, there's no question that we're spending more money on defense than ever before, and we're looking at maritime technology as the great savior. But in the end, we're not moving fast enough, nor are we buying enough capacity to expand our own naval might. We're quite happy to be the small power on the fringe of Asia, doing just enough to make things reasonably safe for us, but not enough for us to secure our lines of supply deep into the mid-Pacific or the mid-Indian Ocean, for that matter. That's going to land Australia in a much bigger pot of mess than I could even imagine. Not unless we end up signing over our sovereignty to the United States at some point and just accept that we are the 51st state of the United States and give up on the idea of Australian sovereignty as a concept because it's all too hard to carry forward.
Such a big part of his book is talking about what happens to China in the world that's coming. This is a country that imports 85% of its food and 85% of its energy. On that basis alone, how does the Chinese population survive the next 2 to 3 years? If the war in Ukraine goes on, if the Russians don't allow wheat exports, if the Russians have to turn off energy fields because they will break if the product is not being taken away, then how do the Chinese import that 85% of their food and fuel? All of the world is suffering from inflation at the moment. And when I talk to people in Africa and Latin America, and I ask them a simple question, hey, has anyone bought a brand new Chinese-made phone or laptop lately? And they go, no, man, inflation's too bad. So the Chinese are using the Japanese model of creating currency out of thin air to build the internal economy. That's great. But they buy food and energy with foreign currency. And they earn that foreign currency by making things that people buy. And whereas the Germans make the premium products for the elite, the Chinese make the everyday products for the majority of us. And if everyone is buying less stuff, how are the Chinese going to get the money to go out and buy the food and fuel that are only going to get more and more expensive? So if we take the logical flow on, the idea of a highly competent, bristling Chinese military going out to dominate the world in 10 years' time. No, they need to be out there now.
Mm-hmm.
Do we believe they can dominate now with essentially a brown water navy and an army that is designed to, to terminate their own people? Probably not.
Right.
So
well, yeah,
the paper tiger of China is, if they nuke us, we're in a world of trouble.
Yeah.
The first 2 days of high-end weapons is a nightmare. The cyber warfare might wreck our infrastructure for 5 years. But the idea of the Chinese dropping off Marines across the world and standing off with standoff weapon systems and sustaining bridgeheads around the world for 6-month, intervals at a time, no, that's delusional. That's the fantasists who think security is about platforms, who don't understand that you need an 18-year-old to volunteer to deploy when they're a 19-year-old, and there to be enough food and fuel on the ship to do the 6-month tour, none of which is currently likely.
And also there's the other aspect of this, and this is something that you and I have been talking about for years, and that is that while everyone is freaking out about the Chinese Navy and its capabilities, the Chinese military, whether it be the People's Liberation Army, the Army Navy, the Army Navy Air Force, its priority mission is the sanctity of the elite of China. It is not a war-fighting structure. Its prime responsibility is to crush dissent locally. Now, if you take an armed force like that and drop it in the middle of the African jungle, they are going to be literally eaten up by local forces because they won't know what the hell they're doing there, and they have had no training to go outside of the Chinese civil space. So I think that, we really do need to have a much more nuanced approach when it comes to the so-called threat posed by China. So I do agree with what you say. Absolutely.
Like, simple question we could pose to all the people that see China as a boogeyman. If China manages to control all of the South China Sea and to pacify every country around the edge of the South China Sea, would that give them a big enough market to sell stuff to earn real currency to buy food and fuel? And if the answer to that question is no, which I believe the answer is, then China should be worried about itself, and we should be more worried about the mess when it implodes than its danger to the world. Now, its danger in terms of nuclear weapons and a couple of days of throwing around high-tech weaponry or cyber is absolutely real. But its danger as a power that can project power constantly and garrison places and lob in munitions from over the horizon, no, that's not something to worry about.
So in the end, David, and I suppose we have to keep an eye on time because of the recording bracket that we're in, but where do you think we ought to be going as a country? What are the policy settings that we ought to be enacting to make sure that we come out of the coming crises, and I mean crises as in plural? What ought we be doing? I mean, it's obvious that our politicians seem not to be able to move beyond their very narrow confines. They lack the capacity for deep thought. They lack the capacity for sustaining deep thought, which is what is needed right now. So how can we change the message so they get the memo and wake up to themselves to the very real dangers that we are going to be facing over the next 10 years or so?
How we get through to them, again, it's the reason I started studying communications. And what I realized, you have to talk to them in a language they understand, which is, how do they stay in power? That's the language they understand. The problem is, will they understand that the world they grew up in, the world that shaped them, the world they won in, is fundamentally over? I'm inclined to believe that the majority of people in politics now will be unelectable within 5 years across the developed world. Because they would just look so profoundly incompetent. But Mr. Prime Minister and Cabinet, if you're listening, some dot points. Reach out very gently and quietly to the Japanese to buy their current spec submarine as our stopgap until we get nuclear subs from America, and lock us into a proper military relationship with Japan. Reach out to the Japanese and say, we want to do very fast train Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Canberra, and to make me happy, Adelaide, even though it's not economically viable. as a major infrastructure project to start getting Australia used to the idea that we can do big things properly. And once again, to lock us in to the Japanese model of technology sharing and transfer. Build a fertilizer plant near a natural gas field with a massive port so that we can move fertilizer all over Australia and the region and guarantee food for all of this Pacific East Asia community that we could be a central part of.
Yeah.
Start making sure that it's very easy from people all over our region to come here and study and then work for up to 5 years in all the industries where we need people, because the best way to get people who will want to be Australians is to give them a chance to be here and see that they enjoyed it. And, you know, at the end of 5 years, if they want to apply for citizenship, great. If they want to go home, that's great too. They got education, we got the benefit of their skills, everyone won. And start seeing our neighbours as, yes, we're all different to each other, but guess what? The future is regional fortresses.
Yep.
That's non-negotiable. So get on with it now and make sure that it's not a fortress of imposition, because we won't have the power to impose. We can only have pull factors. Whatever we're offering has to be appealing. And it will be so much more appealing if it's Japan and us together, and then New Zealand on board, and then Indonesia on board, and then Singapore on board, and then Malaysia on board, and then Thailand on board, and hopefully even Vietnam on board. That bundle together of capable people and hardworking good ideas means outside of North America, we could be the best positioned to deal with the demographic, energy, and food disaster that Zeihan has outlined through data, not ideology. And
tell me something, David. You don't think that the current architecture that people are working on, the CTPP, oh God, I hate that acronym, the CTPP, you know what I'm talking about, that thing that
yes,
is actually going to be replacing the TPP, right? So we went from a very simple acronym to a very complicated and hard to pronounce one, but it basically encompasses a lot of the countries that you mention. But again, it's being run by the same idiots that put us in this mess to begin with. So do we need to start again with a different sort of multinational, that's it, comprehensive and progressive
Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's it. Yeah. Well, I mean, do we need to scrub that and start again? Because obviously we need different types of thinkers to sit within a framework like that to make it work for us as a regional fortress. Really? Yeah.
Yeah. Once again, if the politicians of the current era are unelectable in 5 years, the canapes munchers of the current period are useless now. And will be even more useless in 5 years' time. We need realists, and not in the theoretical sense. We need people who look at the situation and go, we either adapt or we die.
Yeah.
So adapt properly, adapt in an inclusive way, adapt in a way that we maybe all don't have as much stuff, but we live in competent liberal democracies that build a lovely community fortress that covers a big chunk of the world.
You know, just before we go, you just raised the idea that we ought to be living in a world that may be a little bit poorer in terms of our technological specs. And Zeihan says the same thing. But can we take a step back technologically to make lifestyle choices that are far superior? I mean, like, for instance, we have currently a bunch of interlinked global supply chains where, you know, a motor vehicle is built not in one factory plant in a particular nation state, but components come from all over the world. Depending on where market forces dictate, you get the cheapest labor rates, you know, so the wiring will come from, I don't know, South Korea, you know, the metal work will come from, I don't know, Malaysia, and then final assembly will happen in Japan, or you know, it's a rough example. It's not perfect, but you get my drift, right? So how are we going to deal with a world that is predicated on very high technology components, where in the future our global supply chains really bite? we're going to start having to think about building stuff ourselves. I mean, even cars. And those cars that we build are not going to have the center console with a GPS hooked up and all that kind of thing. We're looking at things that look more reminiscent of the 1950s and 60s as opposed to 21st century vehicles moving forward. And, computers, God knows where they're going to come from, because each computer comes from half a dozen different places, which relies on an unbreakable, unbreachable global supply chain. When we live in a world without that, where are we going to get all those sort of technological items so that we can see at least a bit of continuity between the old world and the world to come?
A very large part of the Pacific Southeast Asian region can make mid-tier semiconductors and make mid-tier technology. We don't fall back to the 1950s. We fall back to, at worst, 2005. If you build the right to repair into this system, our iPhones are amazing. We don't need a new one. And normally the bit that doesn't break is the chip. What normally goes is batteries, modems, and screens.
Yeah.
In this world, the right to repair will mean all of those components can be slotted in and out for 20 years. As long as the chip is getting power and doesn't cook from an energy surge, the most critical bit can run for a long time. So in reality, yes, we will need to maintain good relationship with the Americans. We should have good relationships with the Japanese, because they're the two people that will provide, when we do buy a new complicated thing, those rare components that can only be done at the highest of highest tech levels. But that's what makes our region unique, is our region can both do raw materials, food, labor, and most of the technological steps, somewhere from simple to complex. We have a country somewhere in our region that can do that chunk, which is why I'm talking about regional fortresses. We are essentially going back to something that is reminiscent of the late 19th century empires, where within empires, there's huge amounts of trade. But by the terms of the empire, and the empire sets the rates and the values of things, and there is only a little bit of interchange between empires. We need to function like a regional fortress, not an empire, because this has to be, if you're inside the regional fortress, you get the benefits. And our regional fortress will probably interact with the North American regional fortress because of the long-standing cultural ties and security ties. And it makes far more sense with us and the Japanese being on one side of the Pacific and North America being on the other, that there is some degree of continuity between those two regional fortresses. And while we deal with the potential, implosion and possibly likely implosion of China, that is something that can only be done if a couple of regional fortresses are both looking at it and going, well, the problem is not with the Chinese people, it's with the ruthless regime that will crush them to maintain power. What are we going to do with the refugee flow? What are we going to do with the collapse of industry? What are we going to do with starving people getting on boats? We're all going to be dealing with that, whether people head right across the Pacific or head south to us. So in reality, the two major regional fortresses that have the capacity to survive, it will be in their interest to maintain fairly good terms, because the potential blowback of an imploding China, where the CCP get progressively more ruthless, is going to affect all of us.
Yep. Okay, well, everyone, that's a wrap. I have to give my thanks to Peter Zeihan, if you're listening. Great book, very engaging, goddamn depressing, and thought-provoking. So thanks for that. My thanks also to co-host David Oldie and producer Michael Magali for being with us today, and our thanks to the Ozcast Network. Our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategikon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel when they're available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni, and you've been listening to Strategikon, a Sage International podcast.
Awesome.